Traditional question, can you hear me? Yeah. The question of the so-called revolutions in Eastern Europe is one which actually is very important in the history of our particular tendency in Marxism. Because it was really the question of what happened in Eastern Europe was really the issue around which we, when I say we as a tendency, I don't mean me personally, developed our criticism of orthodox Trotskyism. Because the inheritance which we received from Trotsky was inherently ambiguous. Trotsky declared that on the one hand, he said the bureaucracy in Russia is incapable of playing a revolutionary role in the world. At the same time, however, he held that Russia was a degenerated workers' state, and the grounds on which he argued that it was a degenerated workers' state were not his original grounds. His original grounds were that Russia is a country in which the workers still have the possibility of using the existing institutions, the Soviets, the unions and so on, and reforming the system. By the early 30s, he was no longer holding to that position. He was now arguing that what made Russia a degenerated worker state was the existence of state property. And he also held that state property was only possible on the basis of a workers' revolution. That was the inheritance. Then after the war, there was a considerable dilemma for the followers of Trotsky. Because what happened in Eastern Europe was, firstly, that regimes were set up in those countries which were set up and controlled by the Russian bureaucracy. In them there was extensive and finally more or less complete state property. There was no real sign of workers' revolutions. And finally, of course, those regimes were turned into more or less carbon copies of the Stalin regime in Russia. And the Fourth International, immediately after the war, took a position which was inherently contradictory, in that the Fourth International held that the countries of Eastern Europe were capitalist countries because there hadn't been workers' revolutions. On the other hand, and also because there was a continuation of quite a degree of private property in those countries, in the orthodox Western sense, but also they held that Russia was still a workers' state. And increasingly that came under strain as the two types of system, as it were, in the Eastern European countries and Russia became more and more similar. And really that dilemma couldn't be maintained. And in the end, the Fourth International essentially split into two directions. Either people had to say, if Russia is a workers' state, then so also must the regimes in Eastern Europe be, in which case it was no longer necessary for there to be workers' revolutions to create workers' states, which was the line taken by those who are the inheritors of the Fourth International in the organizational sense. Or could say Eastern Europe proves, in a sense, because Eastern Europe is capitalist, it proves actually that Russia must be as well. And there was this division within the Fourth International. Now, eventually the Fourth International, as they fell down on the first side, and to all intents and purposes, as Cliff argued in the late 40s, it took the road of capitulating essentially to a kind of critical Stalinism. In particular, this occurred inside the Fourth International at the time of the Stalin-Tito split. Before the split between Tito and Stalin, the Fourth International had declared that Tito was leading a military capitalist regime. After the Tito-Stalin split, within days after the Tito-Stalin split, they were referring to Yugoslavia's socialist revolution. Suddenly, there was a switch. And once that initial step had been taken, then the rest of the steps followed. And by the early 1950s, there was a new category developed called the deformed workers' state. That's to say, the workers' state which had never been created by a workers' revolution, which was deformed before it was born, like a thalidomide child, as it were. And all over the world, all over Eastern Europe, they were now declared to be worker states, and of course when the Chinese Revolution happened without very little, on the basis of very little independent working class revolutionary activity, that was declared to be a worker state. And of course since then all sorts of other countries have been declared by various adherents of the orthodox Trotskyism also to be worker states. Burma, Iraq, Algeria, Cuba, etc., etc., etc. What that involved from the point of view of the Fourth International, the reason essentially for this, the split out of which we emerged as an independent tendency, was But what the Fourth International did was to abandon the decisive role of the working class, independent working class organisations, and the emphasis on the need for an independent working class Marxist revolutionary party. It's a position which is still held to this day. And you see all sorts of ambiguities in the position, say, of someone like Oliver MacDonald over Solidarity in Poland in 1980 to 1981. Rather than calling for the formation of an independent revolutionary socialist party in Poland, he's looking for various manoeuvres involving the better elements inside the existing Communist Party in Poland and so on. Now, for revolutionary Marxism, I think it's very important to understand what did actually happen in Eastern Europe after the war. Now, Trotsky, I want to start by saying, was absolutely correct in one very important thing, and that is when he insisted that the Stalinist bureaucracy was counter-revolutionary. Let's be quite clear what is meant by counter-revolutionary. Counter-revolutionary doesn't simply mean not revolutionary, not in favour of revolution. It actually means against revolution, opposed to revolutionary development, opposed to working class revolution. That's what counter-revolutionary means. And of course, it's not surprising that the Stalinist bureaucracy should have adopted in the world and a counter-revolutionary politics, given that inside Russia, the bureaucracy had destroyed the working class revolution of 1917. There was nothing left of that by the early 30s, that in fact the regime in Russia rested upon the exploitation and oppression of the great mass of the Russian population, the workers and peasants of Russia, and that naturally was reflected in their foreign policy. Naturally, the bureaucracy in Russia was not simply not revolutionary abroad, it was actually opposed to revolution abroad, afraid of revolution abroad, because of course revolutions abroad can flow back in their effects into Russia and encourage workers and peasants in Russia, in fact, to become revolutionary against the bureaucracy. Their own exploited populations would be infected by the danger of revolution abroad. From 1935, the time of the 7th Congress of the Comintern, the policy essentially of the Stalinist bureaucracy in Russia was to seek to protect and develop their own state power by manoeuvring, if possible, as it were, amongst the rival imperialist powers in the world, seeking accommodations, seeking alliances between, using the contradictions between the Western capitalist imperialist powers to find allies, seek accommodations, and so on. And the fact that, for historical reasons, because of the Russian Revolution, they had links with communist parties across the world, meant that they used the communist parties in various parts of the world for those sorts of purposes, essentially to pursue that policy. And that was very clear in Spain in 1936. There was a debate about it, I think only last night, which unfortunately I missed. It was very clear that the role of the Communist Party in Spain was to prevent any development of working class revolution in Spain, to contain the Spanish Revolution within the framework of bourgeois democracy, similarly with the general strike movement in France in 1936, and so on. In 1939, the Stalin-Hitler Pact was a continuation in essentials of that same policy. And of course what it meant was that the 2 years between 1939 and 1941, effectively even anti-fascist struggle was largely abandoned as a central policy of the communist parties. Now, of course, being a weak capitalist power, as Russia was in the 1930s, did not mean that it was a completely non-imperialist power. It was simply a small-scale imperialist power in the end of the 1930s. But certainly it was it pursued perfectly straightforward, normal capitalist policies. When the Russians marched into Poland in 1939 from the west, a few days later, Stalin's armies marched into Poland from the east. They seized the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and they dismembered Poland, divided it up between them, deported 1.5 million Poles to the east, to corrective labour camps, killing hundreds of thousands of them in the process, incorporated eastern Poland into their empire. When, of course, in 1941, Nazi Germany then invaded Russia, Russia became an ally of the United States, and Great Britain joined the war on the side of the Western Allies. Previously, Stalin had denounced the war from 1939 to 1941. Stalin had denounced the war as an imperialist war, which actually was a formally correct position. Now, the Second World War was dignified as a democratic anti-fascist war. And there were several elements, really, to the policy pursued by the Russian government during the war. Firstly, they pursued the aim of setting up an agreement, essentially, between the powers for spheres of interest in the world. And the whole series of negotiations at Tehran between Churchill and Stalin in Moscow, at the Yalta Conference, and at Potsdam at the end of the war. Agreements through which, essentially, they would each have their own spheres of interest, and they would respect each other's spheres of interest and not interfere in each other's spheres of interest. The Americans were reluctant to accept this, but found that they really didn't have much choice about it. It was Churchill was much happier about it than the Americans, because it was part of his traditional British diplomacy to think in those sorts of terms. In any case, Churchill was not nearly as strong. British capitalism wasn't nearly as strong as the United States. The United States more or less accepted this because they were in no position to fight in Eastern Europe. Stalin was winning victories over Hitler. They had to accept this. They also were looking for Russian aid in the war against Japan in 1944 and early to 45, before they got the atomic bomb. Now, the implication of this was, as far as Western Europe was concerned, that the Russians pursued a policy of not interfering in what they recognized to be the British and American spheres of interest. So that, for example, the Indian Communist Party took a position to the right of the Indian Congress Party during the war. The Indian Congress Party said that they wouldn't support the war against Germany until they had independence. The Indian Communist Party said, no, the most important question is not independence, it's the anti-fascist war, and therefore they didn't support the Congress in its opposition to British imperialism in India on that particular question. In Italy, the Russians effectively accepted the establishment of a regime friendly to the West, a non-democratic regime under Marco Badoglio in Italy after the Allied occupation of Italy. In Greece, Stalin accepted the destruction of the Greek revolutionary movement by Churchill at the end of 1944, the early months of 1945. In fact, Churchill expressed his thanks to Marshal Stalin for expressing so little interest in Greece. After the war, the French and Italian Communist parties joined in coalition governments with the bourgeois parties in France and Italy and contributed mightily to the restabilization of capitalism in Western Europe. The story is very well told in a whole number of books. I'd recommend, for example, the book by I've forgotten his name, F. Clodin, anyway, on the communist movement. He has a great deal of excellent material on this whole question. There's lots of other books on it. In Yugoslavia, Stalin, in fact, opposed the idea that the Yugoslavs should carry through a communist revolution in Yugoslavia, as of course later he was, or during that whole period and later he was to advise Mao not to carry through a communist revolution in China. When I say communist, I mean in quotation marks. In return for this, Stalin asked for and expected no interference with his sphere of interest, which he regarded as Eastern Europe. Now, the pursuit of this whole policy meant that the Russians really had to hide because they necessarily must hide their own imperialist aims, they also hid the imperialist aims of the Allies. Stalin adhered to the Atlantic Charter, which was a document which the Americans and British issued, I think in 1941, I've forgotten the year, which talked about how they were fighting for democracy, for national independence, and so on. It was a hoot as a document, because the British, of course, had the biggest empire in the world, which they had no intention, if they could help it, of giving up, and there they were talking about national independence as the aim of the war. The Americans were the biggest capitalist power in the world, talking about national independence, and of course getting good national democratic independent governments like the government of Haiti to sign this document as well for them. Stalin in 1944 declared that the alliance between his own regime and that of the United States and Britain was founded not on casual transitory considerations but on vital and lasting interest. I think Stalin was certainly not a very good Marxist, and I think he actually believed his own propaganda. He actually believed that it was possible to have a long-term agreement with the Western capitalist powers that in fact they would divide the world up between themselves and so on. It wasn't until 1947 that he got a really quite sharp and rude awakening and changed his policy. Now, it certainly wasn't part of Stalin's policy to establish what he called socialism in Eastern Europe. Poland, for example, he declared, to try to introduce communism into Poland, he said, would be like putting a saddle on a cow. It was later remarked, he was not in favour of nationalisation of industry. The various Communist Party organisations for the various East European countries, most of which had their headquarters in Moscow in this period, came out with declarations against nationalisation and so on. Rather, the aim was to establish what were called friendly coalition governments, that is to say, friendly to the USSR, governments in the East European countries which would be friendly to the USSR, coalition governments in which the local communist parties would play a minority role. And his other aim was to treat Eastern Europe after the war as a zone which would be available for economic exploitation to revitalise the Russian industries which had been destroyed during the war, and to rebuild the basis, in a sense, a sink, as it were, from which to draw materials to reconstruct the Russian economy. So now to pursue that policy required, as the Russian armies came across the borders and took over, beat the Nazis back, took over the various countries of Eastern Europe. To pursue that policy required, first of all, the prevention of domestic revolutionary movements. Now, they varied in extent in different countries. In Bulgaria, one of the first countries to be taken, the fall of the regime in Bulgaria was greeted by the workers of Bulgaria with quite substantial working class activity. Workers themselves engaged in mass arrests of fascists. They set up elected people's tribunals which tried and condemned former fascists. They disarmed the police. They set up workers' militia. They democratized local administration. There were red flags flying over public buildings in Bulgaria. The army set up soldiers' councils and degraded their officers. And generally there was an atmosphere which reporters from the West described as reminiscent of 1917 in Russia, in Bulgaria. Now the Red Army stepped in and stopped that. Marshal Tobulkin, who was the head of the Red Army for that area, it was reported, had no patience with Balkan repetitions of 1917. That was the Economist reporter reporting on this. The soldiers' committees were banned, soldiers were told they had to obey their officers, and so on. Instead, there was established a Fatherland Front government, which was set up under the leadership of a man called Georgiev, who was a right-winger. He'd been the author of the massacre of Bulgarian peasants in 1923 and of a military coup in Bulgaria in 1934. Typical pre-war, right-wing, extreme authoritarian, extreme unpleasant, the sort of person who verges on the edge of being called a fascist if he isn't actually a fascist. He was the head of the new government, the new coalition government set up on the instructions of the Red Army. On the other hand, the other aspect of this, which we find repeated in country after country, there were communists in the government. A man called Yugov, for example, was put into the Ministry of the Interior, a key ministry in all those East European countries, which was used by the Communist Party in all of them after the war, in charge of the police, internal security, and so on. There was, from 1944 to 1946, regularly Communist Party spokesmen explained they had no intention of introducing communism in Bulgaria. In Romania, they supported the monarchy. Long live the king was a communist slogan in Bulgaria in 1945. The coalition government included a man called Tatarescu, who'd led the murder of 11,000 peasants in 1907, who'd been pro-Hitler, and so on. The Minister of War had Hitler's Iron Cross as a special reward. Remember, Romania had fought for most of the war on the side of the Germans against the Russians. They switched as the Red Army approached. They had a small internal coup and switched sides. The Minister of War was one of the people who'd managed to make the switch of sides, and so there he was in charge of Romania, with the Russians being very happy about it and with wearing Hitler's Iron Cross, or presumably keeping it in a drawer. The Communist Party in Russia, this became an issue later in the Romanian Communist Party, I'll come back to it at this time, in fact admitted numbers of former fascists into the ranks of the Communist Party, which was being rebuilt inside Bulgaria. It was only in 1945, in fact, a year afterwards, that those people were purged from membership. It took a year before land reform was introduced in Romania, a year after the establishment of the new regime. In Hungary, there's a similar kind of pattern. I mean, there's quite a degree of similarity between a number of these countries. There are speeches by Imre Nagy, against the introduction of socialism. The factories and the mines were restored to their former owners. And as Colin, his fine book, The Politics of War, remarks, the communists considered left socialism to be the greatest danger in Hungary. In Poland, the major destruction of the revolutionary movement occurred before the arrival of the Red Army. In fact, that was in fact very important. As the Red Army approached Warsaw in July 1944, the indigenous underground army, the Home Army, prepared for an uprising in Warsaw. There's no question that they had every intention they had nationalist intentions. They wanted, in fact, to seize Warsaw before the Russians arrived, so that the Russians would be presented with a fait accompli, namely a domestic revolution, the overthrow of the Nazis themselves. The Red Army approached to the suburbs of Warsaw and then was forced to withdraw by a German advance. No question the Russians were driven back. I mean, there are some polls who say the Russians just sat there and deliberately did nothing. They were, in fact, the military histories, I think, are fairly clear. The Russians were, in fact, forced to withdraw. However, they had, just in the moment of the uprising, they had called for the uprising themselves. They'd been broadcast from Moscow calling for the uprising. What they didn't do was to give any aid whatever to the insurgents in Warsaw, who fought for 2.5 months against the Nazi armies in Warsaw. They hardly supplied any arms to the insurgents. They didn't clear the skies with their aircraft, which they could have done, of the German aeroplanes, which were strapping the working class neighborhoods. They didn't give the United States aeroplanes permission to land on the Russian side of the front because of the distance when they were traveling. The Americans offered to drop supplies to the Warsaw insurgents, and for a long time Stalin refused them permission. They would need to land there to refuel to fly back to Britain where their bases were. In the event, 240,000 people were killed in the Warsaw Uprising, nearly 250,000. The stronghold of the opposition and of the Polish working class was in fact destroyed before the arrival of the Russians. And the Russians were quite happy about this. Now, in Czechoslovakia, there were a number of... Czechoslovakia, there are some countries in which there doesn't seem to be very much in the way of independent working class activity. Czechoslovakia is not one of those countries. In Czechoslovakia, the defeat of the Nazis, in fact, provoked a situation in which workers' councils seized the factories up and down Czechoslovakia, revolutionary guards were established, and so on. The new Communist Party Minister of the Interior instructed them to disarm the revolutionary militia, the factory guards, and oppose the nationalization of industry. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but I'll assume it's pronounced in the same way as a Polish name. So a man called Zakapotsky, who was a leading Communist Party member at the head of the Czech equivalent of the TUC, said, "We are going in the direction of state national capitalism. We must not suppose we are already building a socialist state." That was the position of the Communist Party in the immediate aftermath of the war. The Social Democrats, in fact, in Czechoslovakia were more left-wing than the Communist Party in this period. The workers' councils were, by various kinds of manoeuvres, subordinated to the TUC of Czechoslovakia and contained within a highly bureaucratized framework. In Yugoslavia, of course, we're looking at the counter-revolutionary politics of the Communist parties and the Red Army and so on in this whole period. Then in Yugoslavia, of course, Stalin had consistently discouraged Tito from making Tito's Communist partisans from taking power. He'd urged them to come to an agreement with King Peter, who was in exile in London. At the Moscow meeting, Stalin, in fact, suggested to Churchill, the rather good idea of Churchill was to send the British army up through Yugoslavia, which was something which he already knew very well Tito was completely opposed to. In fact, to Stalin's rage, when Stalin asked Tito what he would do if the British came into Yugoslavia, he said, "Oppose them with every means possible." And Stalin was extremely angry at this. Stalin said to Tito that they really ought to take the red stars off their caps, the Communist partisans. Red stars are really too much, he said. However, Stalin was not in a position to prevent Tito's army, from taking over in Yugoslavia. just as in China, he was not able to prevent Mao Zedong from carrying through his revolution in 1949, and until the last minute, almost the last minute, he was opposed to it doing so. In Western Europe, of course, there was a parallel to this, which I've already mentioned, which is, of course, that the communist parties in Western Europe entered into coalition governments in Western Europe with the bourgeois parties and took on the job of containing working class unrest. I mean, there isn't time to go into the detail of all that. That's almost a subject for another meeting. I think Ian Birchall either will have already talked about it or will be doing so sometime elsewhere in Marxism. The two other aspects, or several other aspects to this whole process of the containment of working class revolutionary politics and revolutionary possibilities at the end of the war. The first one is just in organizational terms. Generally speaking, Stalin and his Red Army commanders preferred to rely on Moscow communists, say Bulgarian communists who spent their time in Moscow, or Romanian communists who spent their time in Moscow, or Hungarian communists who spent their time in Moscow, and so on, rather than local ones, rather than people who'd actually been fighting against the Germans in the period of the war because they were more reliable. There was a tendency for those local ones to be a bit infected by revolutionary ideas and so on, to be less reliable. So there was a preference for what we call the Muscovites in terms of the people who got positions in government. That was true in Czechoslovakia and elsewhere. Secondly, and I think much more appallingly, the communist parties diverted popular demands for social advance, especially in Czechoslovakia and in Poland, diverted demands for social change into demands of an extreme nationalistic character, into anti-Germanism and anti-Hungarianism. In Poland, the figures are fairly astonishing. In Poland, more than 5 million Germans were deported to the West, with British officers, of course, waiting for them at the border to receive them into the Western zone. The empty land which was vacated by the German population that was driven out was then made available for Poles and Czechs to move into. In Czechoslovakia, more than 2.25 million Germans were deported and 650,000 Hungarians. The Communist Party Manifesto in 1946 declared, "We propagate the most beautiful thought, the new Slavism. The Slav states are today the most progressive states in Europe." Complete nationalism. The Communist Party in both Poland and Czechoslovakia took special responsibility for organising the expulsion of the Germans and the Hungarians. Gomulka in Poland, for example, was the minister in charge of the new territories which had been occupied by Poland when all its borders were shifted to the west. Similarly, there was a Communist Party minister in Czechoslovakia. And in conditions of incredible brutality, matched only, or exceeded only by the Nazi treatment of their slaves during the war. Conditions of appalling brutality, whole working classes and peasantries were just dumped out. People who lived there for hundreds of years. And of course, lastly, there's a negative policy, there's always a positive policy as well, and it was summed up by Gottwald, the leader of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia. What you have to make some calls on the population to do something, of course, and what was the call for? More and more work, more and more effort, more and more sweat. That's the centre of the programme for the Communist Party. Now, once coalition governments were established in those countries, then the Communist Party set about monopolising control. Apart from Czechoslovakia, the Communist parties in most of the countries of Eastern Europe really were very, very tiny. They had, they numbered their memberships in hundreds and a few thousand. The Communist Party of Czechoslovakia was the biggest, with an initial membership of about 27,000. They had very little in the way of mass support in most of these European countries, and so essentially what they did was to use police methods, using their control of the Ministry of the Interior and the very presence of the Red Army in those countries, to arrest opposition leaders, to terrorise others into submission, and so on. They dissolved parties, they split parties, and so on, particularly the present parties and the socialist parties in the various countries. They conducted fixed elections. There were a couple of the elections that were free, but I think the election in Hungary in 1945 was free, and the election in Czechoslovakia in 1946 could be said to have been free. The others were fixed. Rakosi described the policy, a Hungarian communist leader, described the policy is a phrase that has since become familiar to many comrades, as treating the opposition as being, he said, our policy in relation to the opposition was slicing them off like salami. The salami tactic, I think the phrase, I don't know if anybody used the phrase the salami tactic before, because in my knowledge of the history of language is not so great, but that seems to be the first one I ever come. I don't know if anybody used the phrase the salami tactic before, because in my knowledge of the history of language is not so great, but that seems to be the first one I ever come across. And what the Communist Party, of course, had to do was to recruit a new social base. I mean, it's insufficient simply to rely on the power of the Red Army and police power. It's necessary to build a new social base. And in fact, in most of those countries, in fact all of them, the Communist parties grew very fast in the initial period after the arrival of the Red Army, in the first months and years of the new regime. For example, in just 3 months of 1945, the Polish Communist Party grew from 30,000 to 300,000. Anyway, a 10 times growth in a period of just 3 months. And all sorts of people joined the Communist Party. I mean, it would be obviously many of the people who joined were careerists, people who got an eye to personal advance. But it was also the case that, for example, many of the peasants in Poland who were given German land became extremely loyal to the Communist Party. That was the area of Poland which afterwards produced the largest degree of peasant loyalty towards the Communist Party, the area which had formerly been German, which is now handed over to Polish peasants. And there were many workers. I think we have to be quite clear. Many workers were attracted to the Communist Party because the Communist Party was identified as being, in some sense, the wave of the future. So that people joined the Communist Party in quite large numbers for a variety of reasons, and in a context in which what the Communist Party was not representing any notion of revolutionary class struggle. Land reform was carried out in many countries. Actually, land reform was not particularly significant because in many of the countries of Eastern Europe, in fact, the major processes of land reform had occurred at the end of the First World War. But it was a significant process in both Poland and Hungary. In Czechoslovakia, they talked about land reform, but the land reform simply consisted in giving peasants land which had formerly belonged to Germans and Hungarians. And there was not otherwise any significant process of land reform in Czechoslovakia. At that time, there was no talk whatever of collectivization of agriculture. In fact, we find communist minister after communist minister declaring their opposition to collectivization of agriculture in the countries of Eastern Europe. As far as nationalization was concerned, to some degree, quite a lot of the industry anyway effectively had to be nationalized because nobody owned it. It had been taken over by the Germans during the war. Effectively, there were no titles of ownership which could in any way be sorted out. The government simply took over as Beneš, the president of Czechoslovakia in this period, former, what party it was? Peasant Party, wasn't it? Czech Socialist Party. Anyway, Beneš explained that really there wasn't any choice in the sense but to nationalise because there was nobody else in the sense who could own a lot of the industry. And particularly, of course, German industry was nationalised. The Communist Party, however, opposed further nationalisations in Czechoslovakia, despite the fact that all sorts of workers' demands came in from different industries, in fact, for nationalisation of their industries. There's quite a good description of this in a in many ways, good book by John Bloomfield called Passive Revolution, which is about the events in Czechoslovakia after all. John Bloomfield, I think, is on the Euro-Communist wing of the Communist Party. Quite a lot of good detailed material in there. He has a curious use of the word left occasionally. Compensation was paid in numbers of countries to former owners, despite the opposition of socialists to this in these countries. No role was allowed for, insignificant role was allowed for workers' councils. As it was explained in Czechoslovakia, by nationalisation we understand the transfer of the property of Germans, Hungarians, traitors and collaborators. In other words, the whole question of nationalisation was being posed 1945, 1946 in Czechoslovakia in nationalist rather than in social class terms. Now, one reason that the Russians wanted compliant governments in Eastern Europe was that they were looting and robbing right across the whole region. The policy of the communist tradition, of course, is to be opposed to reparations. After the First World War, the communist parties of the world opposed reparations on the very simple grounds that workers should not be made to pay for the crimes of their bosses. After the Second World War, however, it was entirely different. Huge reparations were demanded by the Russians and collected by the Red Army. Whole industries were stripped across Europe and shipped back to Russia. It was common also for the rank-and-file soldiers of the Red Army to behave in rather similar ways in relation to the property of individuals that they happened to walk into. And there are all sorts of stories of music. Poles who lived through that period, for example, they described the Russian soldiers with the armfuls of watches and so on, which they collected from the population. It was not only Germany, and not only was it in Germany and in the allies of Germany that reparations were demanded, in Romania, in Hungary, and in Bulgaria, but also in Poland and Czechoslovakia. Also, whole industries were taken away by train back to Russia. Additionally, the Russians set up other forms of exploitation of the whole region. They set up what were called mixed companies, which were effectively a situation where the Russians would take a 50% share in an industry, collect a large part of the product for Russia, and put nothing into the industry. So it was effectively a method of fairly simple, in other words, for robbery. They also organised trade at prices which were particularly beneficial to them. For example, Polish coal. There was a 5-year contract the Polish government was persuaded to enter into, whereby they sold coal to the Russians at $1.25 a tonne, at the very time when the Danes and the Swedes were offering 10 times that amount on the world market for coal. The Russians made a profit out of the whole thing of what's been estimated at $900 million, which isn't bad in the prices of that time. All of this, it has to be said, when Europe was semi-starving. Eastern Europe in particular, and also parts of Western Europe, were in a situation of semi-starvation. In Romania, for example, there was an infant mortality rate of 80%, which is a sign of the sorts of conditions in which the people were living in that region in the period after the war. Now, up to the spring of 1947, this was the general pattern. There are undemocratic coalition governments, there's no talk of socialism, and you have bureaucratized workers' organizations. In the spring of 1947, the pattern of relationships between Moscow and Washington very significantly worsened. Largely because of the moves on the American side, it has to be said. In March, Truman enunciated his doctrine of containment of Soviet expansion and seeking an open door for American business throughout the world, of course including Eastern Europe. In June, the Americans initiated the Marshall Plan, their aid plan for Europe, which involved a straightforward arrangement that you could have aid in return for kicking communists out of your government. And the Czech and Polish governments initially were, including the communists in those governments, were initially in favour of going to the Paris conference to discuss the Marshall Plan because of their desperate need for aid. But they were simply told by Stalin that they were not to go. And there was convened at what was called the Conference of the Comintern in Poland in the summer of 1947, at which now it was declared, in fact, there had been a major split. It was now realised, Stalin announced that there had been a major split between the Allies on the question of policy in relation to, in the war. Sorry, I'll start again. There had been a major split between the Allies, which had previously been denied, in the Allies against Germany. Now the world was divided into two rival camps, he declared. What this involved was quite simply a rapid policy shift as far as Eastern Europe was concerned. Now the policy was to clamp down completely control on Eastern Europe, to impose completely Stalinist policies, completely Stalinist forms of regime in Eastern Europe. For example, suddenly collectivization was on the agenda. Gromulka, in fact, in Poland, opposed collectivization at the Comintern Congress and had his wrists slapped, basically, for suggesting that he should convene a meeting of the Polish Communist Party Central Committee to discuss it. One party rule was to be instituted. The socialist parties were to be merged with the communist parties. Often that was a process which would involve some degree of protest from the membership and then purges and arrests of the opposition leaders within the socialist party. And that process continued, very rapidly instituted in all the countries of Eastern Europe, from the middle of 1947 through to 1948. The one case which is interesting, which looks at first sight as if it might be different to this process, which in fact Isaac Deutscher suggests has got an element of revolution from below about it, is what happened in Czechoslovakia. In February 1948, there occurs what John Bloomfield of the Communist Party calls a passive revolution in Czechoslovakia. It's not a bad description of the process. It's better simply to call it a revolution from above, I think. It was a popular process in the sense that the majority of workers were in favour of it, but it was a completely stage-managed process. There was a one-hour general strike to achieve this revolution, one-hour general strike. The police armed the workers' militia. There was a Works Council Congress called, which the delegates were very carefully fixed in advance in the majority of cases by special rules which said that workers were always to send the chairman of the Works Council as their first delegate, and so on. and then the actual conference was stewarded by armed police, which was, as was explained, an expression of solidarity between the police and the working class. Before the revolution, 80% of Czech industry had anyway been nationalised as a result of the revolution. 95% was now nationalised. After the strike, the stirring revolutionary slogan was uttered by Gottwald to the workers at the end of a mass meeting: "We return again to our work, to our construction work for the completion of the 2-year plan." Tremendous stirring revolutionary slogan, that one. And thereafter, straightforward one-party rule, one list in elections, works councils were then disbanded the following year, and so on and so on. Now, this very process of clamping down and constricting Eastern Europe into a single monolithic system, which is pursued from the middle of 1947 onwards, provoked, of course, a fear in the Kremlin that parts of Eastern Europe would in fact break away from this sphere of influence. Particularly, the threat came from Tito, because Tito had made his own revolution and refused to be simply Stalin's boy in the way that most of the communists of Eastern Europe were entirely happy to be. There'd been talk in 47 and early 48 by Tito and also Dimitrov of Bulgaria about setting up a Balkan Federation, which was rapidly stamped on by Moscow. And there was certainly a fear in the Kremlin that Yugoslavian independence might infect the communist parties of the rest of Eastern Europe, and therefore lead to the impossibility of consolidating the Russian bloc there. And complete submission to Moscow was now demanded, and that led to the split with Tito in the summer of 1948. Within a short period, Tito, who in 1947 had been, together with the Russians, the chief arguer for the Russian line in Eastern Europe, and in the world indeed, suddenly in 1948 the same man is branded a fascist, hyena, an agent of imperialism, and so on and so on. And this was really, the split with Tito was the signal for a dual development. Firstly, for a purge in just about every East European country, of anyone whose loyalty was possibly suspect, especially those who might play the role of national leader, as it were. The sort of, like Gomulka in Poland, who insisted that Poland would not necessarily follow the Russian path exactly. Gomulka is purged in Poland. Reich is purged in Hungary. Kostov is purged in Bulgaria. Many of them people with very long histories of struggle in the communist parties and so on, are suddenly declared to be spies and so on. Later, Slansky in Czechoslovakia. They're the big names. Along with them, tens of thousands of people arrested, tried, executed, many of them. 1% of the population of Czechoslovakia, in fact, was arrested during the purges. An extraordinary repetition, in a sense, in Eastern Europe, in the late 40s and early 50s, of the sorts of things that occurred in the Moscow trials in Russia in the 1930s. Secondly, that's one process, absolute clamping down of iron control, removal of anybody who might even possibly be a threat. And secondly, the forced collectivization of agriculture pushed through in country after country, and 5-year plans instituted, and a straightforward Stalinist industrialization drive introduced into those various countries. Forced development Stalin style is then introduced as economic policy, leading to, over the next few years, considerable cuts in living standards, worsening working and living conditions for workers and peasants, associated with the development of big arms build-up, an emphasis on heavy industry, and so on and so on. And really the iron grip, I can end really by saying the iron grip which was then established lasted until Stalin's death. After Stalin's death there's a whole new era which opens up in the history of Eastern Europe, which there is obviously is beyond my subject matter. I think the conclusion that we can come to, though, I'm just winding up, is that there was a revolution of a kind in Eastern Europe, but it was not a social revolution. And it was certainly not, in any sense, a socialist revolution. It was a category which we can recognise as having happened in other countries in the world, part of the process of capitalist development. What one writer has called a revolution from above, in which state power is seized and concentrated and manipulated in the hands of men devoted to rapid competitive accumulation of their national capital, or their bloc capital. It involved the extension in the world of the state capitalist form of capitalism, the state capitalism. And really that's what happened. The only thing that one can say that was its benefit is the same sort of thing that one can say about the development of capitalism in the West, namely that the result has been the considerable expansion through the process of exploitation and the development of accumulation the process of development of a very much bigger working class, which of course in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s has proved to be a tremendous threat to the regimes there, and which in the long run we shall join with in solidarity as part of a genuine process of socialist revolution in the world.